So in February of 2008, Dad Labs produced our first video on the subject of BPA. At the time, we were completely freaked out that this unknown additive was somehow in the world and causing problems for our own kids. At the time, we had some recommendations about ways to minimize exposure and things you could do, but we haven't heard a whole lot in this topic in the last couple of years. So I decided to get in touch with Jeremiah McNichols from ZRecommends, or Zrex.com, who's been covering this topic for a while. I really trust his site and his judgment. I thought he'd be the perfect person to talk to on this subject. Jeremiah, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
So it's been a couple of years since the initial sort of wave of information about BPA came out. Has this problem been solved? We look and see a lot of BPA-free products. Is this something that parents don't need to worry about anymore?
No, it's definitely something that parents should still be aware of and alert of for several reasons. One is that there have been attempts at the national level to regulate BPA or to restrict the use of BPA in certain products, and year after year it's failed to pass. So there's currently a Safer Chemicals Act that just was relaunched in Congress by a senator from New Jersey who has been spearheading this every year since 2008. And frankly, 2008 looked like the best year to pass it. It was the year that CPSIA, Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act, passed. There was a lot of headwind behind reforming, what was in products, the lead scare, it was all that stuff. But it failed, and so it was reintroduced in 2009, 2010, and now it's back. So the prospects of that, maybe they're better this year. The American Academy of Pediatrics has now made a statement just within the last week saying that they believe that the overarching legislation that would help regulate things like BPA needs to be reformed. And that's the Toxic Substances Control Act, which, by the way, was actually drafted into law in 1976 and hasn't been updated since then. And at the time it was passed, there were about 62,000 chemicals in use in products. And they were basically all grandfathered in. And the EPA was charged with basically proving that a particular chemical posed an unreasonable risk before they could require any of a number of steps to be taken. And they've done that with about I think I read it was about 2,000 chemicals that they have actually acted on. But in that same time span, there have been another 25,000 chemicals that have been introduced, and so we're still looking at a huge mass of chemicals in materials that we really know very little about.
So even though we see all these products that are advertised as being BPA free, this is all being done on a volunteer basis just because this chemical has a bad reputation, not because companies are compelled to keep this product out of the marketplace.
Well, one thing that has spurred companies to move on this is regulations at the state level. There are 8 states that have banned BPA in baby bottles and sippy cups in their states. So any national distributor, any big company has a lot of pressure on them to move away from BPA because they don't want to have to cut up their market and have different products. For most of these are in the Northeast and then some in the Northwest. These states are sort of pushing companies to make changes on a national or even a global scale just to be able to sell in their markets. So you don't even have to live in those states to reap the benefits of that. That's something that's happened at a national level. And BPA is basically out of U.S. distributed baby bottles. So it's good to look for that BPA-free label. There is a chance that some little company is going to either not know what they're doing or find it as a cheap material or a good solution for some problem, and they're going to try to market it and hope that nobody notices. So definitely still look for the BPA-free label on baby bottles, but you are not very likely to find a bottle that's made of polycarbonate plastic which contains BPA.
But there's still BPA is it being used in other applications, and are people still getting exposure to BPA?
Yes. I mean, for one thing, there are a lot of surprising exposures that people get to BPA, which, if I can table that for 1 second and say, as far as children are concerned, there are even these states that have regulations don't have any regulations on teething toys, on pacifiers, on bath toys. Those all 3 are areas that we believe should be regulated because they're likely to go in the mouth, they're exposed to hot water. The conditions that we know can cause BPA to leach from a plastic, in addition to wear and tear, its heat, are likely sources of migration of the chemical into a substance that can then penetrate the child's skin or that they're going to put in their mouth and directly ingest. And those things are not regulated at all. The other aspect of a lack of national policy on this is that the question of what it means for something to be BPA free is sort of up in the air. I mean, you can say, we've tested our products and we know that they're BPA free, but when you're not talking about polycarbonate plastic, there still are other materials that may use BPA in their manufacturing, and so it's a question of how deep you're testing. To what level are you testing? What is the quality of your test? And when there's no regulation saying that the testing even has to be done, then it's sort of up to us to assume the goodwill on the part of the manufacturers or their integrity, or to work with companies, to spend our money with companies that we trust. So I would say the best companies to deal with are the ones that have been in the business of providing BPA-free products. And in 2008 and 2009, there were a lot of new baby bottle and sippy cup and children's product companies that were launched in this weird window of opportunity in the infant products market, when the big companies were stonewalling and they saw a market opportunity as well as a chance to do some good and came on the scene. Now, some of those haven't even survived. There's sort of a winnowing process that's happened, but the ones that still do are some of your best bets, knowing that they have been in business trying to, their whole business model has been trying to, move the ball forward as far as safety. And they're probably going to be doing, some of them at least, are probably going to be doing the best testing that's out there.
And are those, can you name any of those these are the ones that you feel the most comfortable recommending? Can you recommend a couple to us?
The best plastic baby bottle manufacturer out there, I would say, is probably Think Baby. They were one of the companies that came on with a variety of baby products in, whether it was 2008 or 2009, and they have gotten stronger, expanded their distribution, survive that round of companies being, sort of beaten out of the market, and they do extremely rigorous testing.
They're also based here in Austin, are they not?
Oh yeah, you guys are in Austin too. Yes, Think Baby, Think Operations, which is Think Baby and Think Sport. They make adult water bottles that are stainless steel, and they also they make sunscreen now too. So they've gotten into those chemical issues around what we put on our skin.
Remind me for just a second, what exactly are the health concerns surrounding BPA, and why is it so important that we keep it away, particularly from pregnant moms and from infants?
Well, it's known to be an endocrine disruptor, which means that it mimics the behavior of hormones that are present in your body. So it basically tricks your body into thinking that it's a hormone, and hormones are compounds that cause your body to have a particular response. So growth, physical development. And so especially with in utero exposure and infant exposure, there are questions about its potential impact on neurological development, on later social behaviors. One of the more interesting studies that came out in the last year or so was something of a sort of a semi-longitudinal study about tracking kids who had high BPA exposures, back in the late 2000s, and seeing what their behavior patterns are now and if they can track any differences in those. The key to all these studies, there have been studies all across the board linking BPA to all kinds of crazy things, but the key is the replicability of those findings. If you see multiple studies coming out finding the same conclusions, and with the breadth of things that scientists are exploring, with the potential effects of an endocrine disruptor, it's hard to really nail down exactly what those things might be. It's just that there's enough concern in enough different areas, and enough of the major players are behind this. The FDA, a lot of industry organizations now are coming to realize that there's enough going on here that it really is a chemical that should just be retired.
So it's important that we minimize our exposure, most particularly in the window, and importantly for women that are expecting or are anticipating getting pregnant. Obviously, with infants and babies, the bottles and the cups and all the plastics they come in contact with, what are sources of potential exposure that could be avoided? What are some ways to minimize exposure, particularly for pregnant women and for babies?
For pregnant women, knowing about other sources of BPA is helpful. One that's been in the news recently but has been known about for several years is credit card receipts. Credit card receipts are used with a thermal paper that thermal property is partially based on the use of BPA. So handling that, I haven't seen studies about the effects of handling these receipts, but that is a major source of BPA coming into our waste stream, frankly. So that's how a lot of BPA gets into the water. That's how BPA can even get into recycled paper products, toilet paper, crazy things like that. So one thing that an adult could do would be to forego credit card receipts when you don't need them. You know, have a habit of not taking them rather than taking them. But another thing is just being aware that there's no regulation on BPA being used in adult products like sports bottles and things like that. So some companies have moved away from making polycarbonate bottles like Nalgene and other companies, but there's a lot more wiggle room for companies to keep using polycarbonate, assuming that consumers won't notice or won't care. So making sure that you're using either a BPA-free water bottle or go with stainless steel or some other material.
You've been keeping tabs on this subject. Are you optimistic? Do you feel that we're making progress on this topic, or are you still really concerned about the presence of BPA in our world?
I think as far as BPA specifically, a lot of progress has been made. I think that more generally speaking, the issue with BPA speaks to a broader problem, which is that the Toxic Substances Control Act is outdated and doesn't do what it needs to do to protect us from a huge variety of chemicals that we don't know enough about. And one of the interesting things that we saw as we were sort of in the thick of this push to get companies to change their practices, because that was the side we were used to working with companies reviewing products, and so that was the outlet that we saw, is dealing with companies, putting consumer pressure on companies to change the materials they were using rather than the regulatory side of things. And so one of the things that we saw in that process was that sometimes when you get what you ask for, you don't know what you got. And in this case, it's, industry moved to other materials, newer materials, about which there are proprietary secrets and things that aren't known. And, the best solutions really are glass, stainless steel, and polypropylene, number 5 plastic if it's from a known source, if it's from a source that you trust. So I would say that, yes, we're still concerned about BPA from both a public health standpoint and an environmental standpoint, because all that BPA in these products that's migrating out of these plastics, that's being chopped up in these credit card receipts, is ending up in landfills, in the water table, in very susceptible and sensitive animal and plant communities, and that's why a lot of this comes back to the EPA. Is it's not just a question of how it accretes or affects our bodies, but the environment as a whole.
So if parents on hearing this grow concerned enough that they want to become politically active, or they want to try to encourage regulation, is there any specific steps that they could take to try and increase the regulation of BPA?
As far as activism is concerned, saferchemicals.org is a great site to check out. They're sort of a hub of information about current legislation, and have a lot of information about the Safer Chemicals Act. They also have routes to help you contact your congressmen and senators. That's a good route, directly contacting the people who represent you and telling them that you're concerned about this issue. I would put a lot more stock in that than petitions. Those are very easy to sign, and so very easy to ignore. But taking that effort to, whether it's write a letter or make a phone call and get as high up the food chain as you can to tell people that you treat this issue seriously and are concerned about it is very valuable. As far as other things that parents can do is, by supporting those companies that have taken a stand on this issue, that have been very aggressive in moving away from BPA or never using it in the first place. We put a lot of stock in those marketplace influences. And really, the story of getting BPA out of kids has been more a story of movements in the marketplace than movements in regulation. I'm sure those state bans have had a big effect, but a lot of the biggest companies were already headed that way because they just didn't want the controversy. And so they made the move voluntarily when they saw that enough consumers were concerned about it. So I guess continuing that in other product areas, continuing to support companies that are not going to put it in their pacifiers, that aren't going to put it in their in their infant toys, teethers, things like that. Getting back to those, not just BPA-free products, but BPA-free companies is a big part of that. Another way that probably one of the greatest exposures that pregnant women have to BPA is through canned food. So one of the most important things that a pregnant woman can do, or someone who is anticipating being pregnant, is to limit their consumption of canned foods. It's also one of the biggest exposures that older children have who are out of the baby bottle and sippy cup age. If they're eating a lot of food from cans, there is BPA in the epoxy lining of cans. We've been waiting for years for the canning industry to take it out, and they've gone from just abject resistance and anger over it even being considered an issue to saying that they are developing alternatives and that it's going to take time. So just absolutely, if you're pregnant, I would say you can probably cut your BPA exposure down by, well, I would just guess maybe 90% by avoiding eating canned foods, because a lot of BPA migrates out of that can directly into the food. Another thing for pregnant women and for just entire families to consider is, although you may see claims that plastic is microwavable or that certain types of plastic are microwavable, we would recommend against that, just on the basic precautionary principle and what we know about the way that chemicals leach out of plastics. You have a container, you have food in it, there is going to be some migration of something coming out of that plastic into the food that you're going to then serve to your child or eat yourself. So I would say don't microwave plastics. Use traditional types of dishes to microwave your foods. If you want to go a step further, even in our household we don't run plastic in the dishwasher. So I mean, if you're running that through a very hot water cycle, again, that's something where we know that the way that BPA leaches out of products is largely from exposure to heat as well as from scratching. So putting them in the dishwasher is not a great idea. And that's actually one of the ways that we found ourselves reducing the amount of plastic that we use in cooking and eating overall, is the hassle of hand washing 25% of your dishes that you don't want to put in the dishwasher. You start being a little more creative and seeing those alternatives that are out there, which are often just as good or better products that you can be using. It used to be that a lot of companies argued for BPA being an okay chemical to use in infant products because it was not banned in the EU, because the European Union considered it acceptable, and they regulate all kinds of stuff that we don't. So the argument was, if it's okay for the EU, it should be okay for the US, which has a much shabbier record on regulating hazardous chemicals. But the EU has now banned BPA in baby bottles. I think it's baby bottles only, but they have instituted the ban. I think March 1st it went into effect for manufacturing, and then in June it's going to go into effect for advertising, and they're basically phasing out BPA from infant products. So that's another source of pressure on the US to take some action and sort of keep up with the science.
So I've got a couple of recommendations. One is to keep BPA out of your life to the greatest extent possible, keeping it away from your expecting partner or spouse, and keeping it away from your kids. My other recommendation is you need to check out Z Recommends at zrex.com. This is a fantastic source of information and product reviews that's untainted by any commercial influence. These guys have tremendous integrity. They're super smart, as you can tell, and it's a great blog to read on a regular basis. You need to bookmark it, put it in your feed reader, read Z Rex at least every week. Jeremiah, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.